I'm Maggie Ladenstein. I'm the director of ICPSR, and I'm really pleased that you are all here with us today. Welcome you to the 2026 ICPSR Data Fair at Love Data Week. There are lots of other activities going on all around the world and all week long here at ICPSR and elsewhere. Please take a look at the schedule. Today, we are going to talk about disappearing data, monitoring federal SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity data losses, and about advancing accountability. I'd like to give a warm welcome to our special guest presenters from the Movement Advancement Project, the Williams Institute, and Essential Data and the Data Index. I'll let each of them introduce themselves as we go. We're going to start off the presentation with Caroline Medina from the Movement Advancement Project. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen to get us started. Can you all see that okay? Okay, great. So yeah, thanks so much, Maggie. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and very excited for today's discussion. I am Caroline Medina. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the senior advisor for data policy at Movement Advancement Project, which is a think tank working to create a thriving, inclusive, and equitable America. You might be familiar with us from some of our equality maps, which are very popular, but my portfolio in particular focuses on leading advocacy, policy, and research initiatives to strengthen the ethical and responsible governance of sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI data, in order to ensure those data support evidence-based policymaking, civil rights enforcement, and intersectional research that benefits all communities. So one core pillar of that work is promoting accountability, transparency, and scientific integrity, especially at the federal level, which we will be focused on a lot of today. I'm excited for our conversation and not only talking about what data have been disappearing, but also what actions and resources can help us meet this moment. In terms of an agenda, I'm going to provide some background on progress that was made heading into 2025, and then a brief overview of an important executive order signed by President Trump that is really driving the federal government's current approach to SOGI data. And then I'll turn it over to my colleagues from the Williams Institute to talk about monitoring efforts and accountability before then turning it over to Denise to share more about some of the resources that y'all can utilize and actively contribute to. So first, I'm going to talk very briefly about the importance of SOGI data collection, which is a priority for our organizations for a number of reasons. But essentially, high-quality SOGI data provide us with a more comprehensive and accurate understanding of LGBTQ communities. We use those data to shed light on the experiences and needs of the LGBTQ population, to raise awareness about challenges that we face, and to prompt action to address those needs at the local, state, or federal level. Here, I've enumerated a few examples of why MAP prioritizes this work, because these data are necessary to advance research agendas, especially those that apply an intersectional lens, which requires disaggregating SOGI data along with other demographic data, such as race, ethnicity, and disability, et cetera. We also use these data to evaluate population trends. What does the growth of the LGBTQ population look like over time and in different geographic regions, for example. The data also help to inform the design, delivery, and evaluation of services to meet the needs of program recipients, to track and address discrimination against LGBTQ populations through surveys or civil rights complaint forms, to equitably distribute funds to make sure that communities are receiving their fair share of resources, and to develop evidence-based policy solutions. For example, we can use these data to monitor LGBTQ community impacts of a particular policy intervention in order to improve health equity, or to assess how discriminatory policies are impacting LGBTQ populations, which is unfortunately especially important given the surge in anti-LGBTQ efforts that we have seen in states and federally across the country over the last few years. Today's conversation will focus primarily on data disappearing from federal government data sets. And before we talk about the drastic shifts that we've seen start to occur in 2025, I want to ground us in some background about the state of play heading into last year. It's really important to understand that we saw meaningful progress on LGBTQ data inclusion under the Biden-Harris administration, and I highlight here a couple of big milestones. So the first is a 2022 National Academies report, which was a consensus report on measuring sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. The National Academies, or the NASM panel, undertook a rigorous in-depth review of current measures and methodological evidence related to data collection on LGBTQI communities in order to improve the National Institutes of Health's ability to identify and address the specific needs of those populations. The report is it's very long and very comprehensive. There are issue briefs that you can find to sort of distill information about the different constructs that they look at. But there are two notable outcomes of the report. So they provide consistent and reliable constructs for sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status, offering evidence to support adding those measures to various data collection settings. Secondly, they also issued important recommendations for areas of future research, testing, and development of measures for SOGI SC. So, for example, testing translation of these measures in non-English languages, especially Spanish. While many people often focus on the question designs that are recommended by the report, which are very important, the report's endorsement for areas of priority research, I think, is often overlooked and hugely important in terms of looking ahead for the future of how we improve the collection of these data and how they perform in federal data collection. The report itself was really a critical resource for researchers, advocates, and policymakers. We use this report to build momentum and to push policymakers, especially under the Biden administration, to advance LGBTQI data equity. And then the second item that I've really highlighted here is an executive order that was signed by President Biden. So this was in 2022, and Section 11 of this executive order specifically focused on improving how federal agencies collect and use SOGI data. It set in motion a series of actions that really began to strengthen the federal data infrastructure for SOGI data collection. And there are three main outcomes from this executive order that I wanted to highlight. So the first is that the Office of Management and Budget issued guidance to federal agencies on collecting SOGI data on federally supported surveys. Now, while this guidance does not carry the weight of, for example, a statistical policy directive, which exists for race and ethnicity, it was still an important step for OMB, which is charged with overseeing the federal statistical system, to develop this guidance because it both signaled the importance of SOGI data collection and also gave agencies a roadmap for how to move forward with collecting these data on their many surveys. The executive order also resulted in the development of a federal evidence agenda on LGBTQI equity, which identified major evidence gaps and outlined how agencies can responsibly collect and use SOGI data to advance equity while protecting privacy, security, and civil rights. This is a really wonderful document that I highly recommend people take a look at, and we can share the links for that as well. Lastly, the executive order also charged all agencies with developing and implementing SOGI SC data action plans, detailing how each agency will use data and the recommendations from the evidence agenda to advance equity for LGBTQI individuals. And many agencies developed these plans, with a number of them being made publicly available. I think here I've linked to the Department of Housing and Urban Development plan, but plans were also put out by the Census Bureau, the Department of Health and Human Services, and many others. And together, these efforts didn't just expand the inclusion of SOGI questions in federal collections, which is of course important, but they also improved the internal processes and practices that guide how agencies collect, manage, and share these data. So to provide a few examples about the advancements that began under the Biden administration, I'll highlight a few things. So as I said, SOGI measures were added to a wide variety of federal data collection instruments under this administration. So that includes things like the healthcare.gov marketplace application, standards related to how electronic health records capture and exchange SOGI data, and federal surveys. So for example, the National Health Interview Survey added a gender identity measure. And this is really important because NHIS is used to monitor trends in illness and disability, to track progress towards achieving national health objectives, to determine barriers to appropriate care, and to evaluate federal health programs. There were also notable advancements in methodological research. Most notably, the Census Bureau conducted both cognitive research and a field test to assess the feasibility of adding SOGI measures to the American Community Survey. This was a huge deal. The ACS is the premier source of social, economic, housing, and demographic data about the US population. The data are used to allocate trillions of dollars in federal funding that are distributed to states, localities, and tribal communities across the country. They're used to develop and implement evidence-based policies and programs, and to monitor and enforce civil rights laws to ensure equal opportunity. The ACS in many ways sort of serves as a gold standard for how questions across federal government are asked, so potential inclusion of SOGI was a very, very big deal. But beyond specific instruments like the ACS or NHIS, it's important to keep in mind the ways in which data policies and practices were really holistically changed. So I've linked here to an example from the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS, which issued a checklist that provided guidance to HHS divisions about how to incorporate SOGI data considerations into their information collection requests that they have to submit to the Office of Management and Budget. And this was a really clear checklist that stated if a federal collection is capturing demographic data that is not solely related to program eligibility, and it does not currently have SOGI questions, then the agency should work to include SOGI data elements as soon as feasible. So this was a really concrete document, and I think speaks to sort of the holistic approach that HHS, but also more broadly, many agencies under the Biden administration were seeking to adopt. And then we fast forward a little bit to 2025. So I have linked here to a highly influential executive order that was signed by President Trump on the first day of his second term. And this executive order attempts to redefine sex for all federal policy purposes as binary and immutable, and it attempts to deny the reality that transgender, non-binary, and intersex people exist and have rights under the law. Section 3 of this executive order relates directly to data collection, and it directs federal agencies to collect information on sex strictly as male or female and prohibits the collection of information on gender identity. This approach to data collection, which is mirrored in legislation introduced in Congress, contradicts scientific consensus and decades of rigorous methodological research about measuring sex and gender. By ignoring the multidimensional nature of sex and the role of gender in shaping people's everyday lives, the directive introduces confusion into federal data, particularly for trans, non-binary, gender-expansive, and intersex people whose lives do not fit the government's narrowed definition. And this executive order is now being used to justify sweeping rollbacks of LGBTQ inclusive data sets across federal agencies. The vast majority of these changes have focused on removing questions that allow trans, non-binary, and gender-expansive people to self-identify, but the executive order is also being used by agencies to justify the removal of sexual orientation measures, even though that is not explicitly named in the executive order. So I'll pause there, sort of having laid the overview out of this executive order, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues at the Williams Institute to talk more about the far-reaching consequences of this executive order on federal SOGI data disappearing.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you to ICPSR for having us and having this conversation about data, which we love. Um, my name's Alana Redfield. I am an attorney with the Williams Institute, which is a research organization based at UCLA. And we are longtime users of federal SOGI data where it existed and have worked alongside many of you all, as well as Caroline, to try to make better and more data available for understanding LGBTQ and intersex communities. Um, so when Caroline talked about the Executive Order 14168, as we know, executive orders are generally marching orders. They're essentially directives to from the executive branch to the various agency heads and those who have the actual authority to do specific actions to carry them forward in alignment with the administration's ideologies. And so what we know is this is par for the course, routine that an executive order will often result in various directives on how to comply. In the case of 14168, which, as Caroline described, is quite sweeping and essentially says that we no longer think this such a thing as a transgender person exists, and we are no longer going to do any research um, or devote resources to understanding transgender people, intersex people, and to some extent LGBT people. Then the agencies had to figure out how to implement that. So. So we saw a directive from OMB, uh, which came out pretty quickly after the executive order. And there were other executive orders, as we know, including the DEI-focused executive order, that also directed the government to stop studying, understanding, discussing, acknowledging the existence of different identities and communities and their needs. So, um, so after the original implementation memo came from OMB, there was a memo from OPM uh, direct to agencies to explain how to apply the memo and the executive order, and then a memorandum from OMB that specifically pertains to data. So we'll talk a little bit more about the OMB memo regarding data in a second, but first I should mention that as a result of the executive order and its implementing memoranda, we saw unbelievable devastation, I'll call it, within the federal government. So, for example, we saw all these web pages coming down, and at this stage in the game, a year later, I think most of us are familiar with this, but websites hosted by the federal government that referenced any of the topics addressed in the memos were removed at a massive scale and very quickly without much process whatsoever, almost immediately removed. Data sets were pulled down, like household pulse survey, and essentially, ultimately, nearly all gender identity inclusive data sets, but we'll talk about that in a second. Um, and guidebooks, code books, everything that provides support to those collections as well. We also saw research pulled down that was ostensibly federally funded, but pertained to gender identity, and to some extent sexual orientation. So LGBT research was pulled down. Staff was cut tremendously at the agencies, and one estimate is that HHS reduced its workforce by 25%. Um, and as we know, some of the devastation was even more widespread, including agencies like USAID. We also understand that over $800 million worth of research grants were terminated. Um, and all of this connected directly to these executive orders, um, essentially saying that they cannot continue to do this work. And we're seeing this across all kinds of federal documents, that they cannot continue to do these various types of work because they conflict with the executive order. Caroline, can you go to slide 10? Thank you. So before we talk about the specifics of the removals, I just wanted to note that there, of course, were challenges to all these removals, and there were very comprehensive, smart legal arguments that were made. And I want to flag a couple cases that are worth looking into. There is the Schiff case, which was challenging the removal of research, and that they made some procedural arguments, but also the argument that it would challenge their free speech rights to remove published research. There was the Doctors for America case, which challenged the removal of websites and data sets. There was the Washington State Medical Association case, which challenged the removal of data, and particularly operational data that was used to perform the function of the grant recipients. Um, and then there was another case challenging the removal under FOIA, which I'll talk about in a second. But I want to note that a lot of these challenges were immediately successful, meaning that immediately the plaintiffs were able to get injunctions or restraining orders to prevent the removal of these websites. And in fact, pretty quickly, we heard about in the Doctors for America lawsuit and the Schiff lawsuit, we saw that websites were restored. And but they were restored with this little message on them that said like this, we don't agree with this, but we have to put it up. Um, and so I apologize, I don't have an example of that, but maybe we can share that later. Uh, and and so there was an immediate positive response, but it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these challenges were procedural, meaning that it was about how they did it that they didn't follow the right protocols under either the Administrative Procedure Act or the Paperwork Reduction Act, which applies to all these executive actions by agencies. So there are some reasons to be worried that the lawsuits won't save this data forever, but there are also other challenges. So I mentioned the challenge, the Freeman case, which challenges the removal of the ACS data, and that is essentially requesting access to data and findings that were prepared as part of the ACS process of testing and investigating SOGI measures. And that one is actually brought under FOIA. So essentially arguing a right to transparency around those processes and the things that were learned through that process. And that case is ongoing. Um, so I wanted to talk about the lawsuits before we go back to the what we've been finding around the data sets. To keep in mind that on the one hand, there were a lot of victories challenging these heinous immediate acts, and on the other hand, we're actually continuing to find that all these data sets are gone, or they're at least attempting to be erased. Caroline, could you go back to the slide 9, please? Thank you. So I'm going to just tee up my wonderful colleague Lauren to talk a little bit about our work. So what I'll mention here is that we immediately wanted to know what has happened. So as Caroline described, there were dozens of agency data action plans, and we had obtained several of them, and we were able to know ahead of time that there were a lot of data sets that did include SOGI. So we were able to we immediately felt like, okay, how can we track and assess what's happening to the data sets as we know them? And so we took uh, our very aspirational list of federal surveys that we wanted to include SOGI someday, and we looked at it and confirmed which ones, maybe the dreams came true in 2023, 2024. And then from there, my colleague Lauren led the charge, along with some other colleagues at the Williams Institute, to try to really investigate what was happening to those data sets. So I'll turn it over to Lauren now.
Thank you, Alana. Yeah, so I think we were surprised by how many collections have actually included sexual orientation and gender identity when we started this process. So as members of the public, there's a couple ways that we can follow how these directives, these executive orders are being implemented on the ground within these agencies. And two ways are the Federal Register and Reg Info. So we relied on these two things heavily to track all of these changes to federal data collections. So agencies are required by the Office of Management and Budget to submit requests to if they want to collect information from the public. And they also have to get approval if they want to make changes to any of those collections. If the changes are substantive enough, they have to post that in the Federal Register and open it up for the public to comment on. If they're considered non-substantive, I'm summarizing this very simply. If they're considered non-substantive, then they can simply submit the request through Reg Info, which is a public-facing website that we can all see, and OMB can approve that change that way. So this is a place, Reg Info is a place where we can see the documentation and we can hopefully see questionnaires, what they look like before, what they look like now, that sort of thing. So as far as SOGI removals go, the OMB guided agencies that they could use non-substantive changes to remove sexual orientation and gender identity from their surveys and data collections. So that's the majority of how these things were removed. And so outside of just to add, outside of Federal Register and Reg Info, we also, of course, rely on important things like journalism and media coverage, because sometimes we can't get this sort of insider information or firsthand accounts of kind of what's going on or context. And also, I heavily relied on things like the Wayback Machine and other crowdsourcing kind of archives like Data Index, big time. So yeah, in terms of the actual removals, hundreds. We have counted at this point 360 that we've verified, but there's more. I mean, this is all that we've found. And so, like was mentioned, the majority is gender identity that's been removed. But also we've found 60 collections at least that have removed sexual orientation, even though they didn't specifically have to. And that's spanning all types of collections. So there's the big national surveys and surveillance systems, which are heavily used by researchers. There's more internal things like evaluation research and programmatic monitoring. If you can imagine all the programs that the government funds all across the country and all the data they collect on clients and just to monitor their programs to see the populations they're serving. And then also administrative forms and databases. And those things are internal, but then sometimes they also post the results of those publicly, and policymakers and researchers also use that. So just to give an example of I would just to let you know, yeah, we tracked identity, so how you identify, if you identify as sexual or gender minority, but also questions that ask about like discrimination or hate crimes. Some surveys will include gender identity and sexual orientation as response options, so people can identify those as the reasons for maybe why they were targeted or why they think they experienced some sort of discrimination. So just to give you a few examples, there's so many to choose from because there's 360 collections, but some big ones that we use are the behavioral risk factor surveillance system and the YRBS, also the youth risk behavior survey. And so these are gigantic, important national surveys that have included gender identity for years. We use them to do our population estimates. They've removed gender identity. There's also things like the GSS, the General Social Survey, which is an independently run survey, but it is federally funded. So even those types of collections are removing gender identity. So then an example of a programmatic one would be a really important one is the homeless management information system. There's also a youth version of that. And they had a required sexual orientation as a required data element that they collect on their clients. And so that's been removed. Something like the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, which is also a giant program that funds direct medical care across the country for people diagnosed with HIV, also has removed gender identity. And then things like an administrative example would be like the US passports, which we did have the ability to select gender identity. Now the X gender marker has been removed. We have reports coming out soon, MAP and Williams Institute, so please look out for those with more information on that. Pass it over.
Thank you. And I think, as Lauren mentioned, there are all these mechanisms that have been used to make the changes, and the vast majority of them were made through non-substantive change or categorized that way. Um, and so only a few went through a notice and comment period, but some of them did. And all of these collections have to be renewed at some point. And so when there are renewal proposals, there is a public comment period for all of them. And so there have been, historically, whenever the government were to propose to include SOGI measures or to test them or to consider them, we would rush into public to provide a comment. So in this circumstance, it's a little questionable as to whether or not it will be heeded, although it's certainly important to make sure that various, opposition or data or evidence that you want to share is considered in the record. There are some like the National Crime Victimization Survey where we saw, where we actually submitted a comment, and I think others have submitted comments in many of the collection changes, where, essentially they're open for public comment, even though they're not really discussing or considering restoring SOGI in it. And so what I would note about that is one last thing, and Laura, I don't think you mentioned this, but some of these collections do have some kind of statutory connection, like National Crime Victimization Survey it's been recognized that there is a connection to the enforcement of hate crime protections. And so there is quite a strong argument that they can't be just unilaterally removing these. There are arguments that can be made. We actually made the argument for the NCVS that the removal of demographic questions, they left in bias motivation questions like were you targeted because of your gender identity, but they removed the demographic questions about who is trans. And so we argued that by removing the demographic questions, it undermines the quality of the data because you can't get a denominator. So anyway, arguments like that are really important. So I want to just plug that last piece as we transition over to our next segment of this presentation. That public comments still do matter.
Hey there. I'm Denise Ross. I served as the chief data scientist of the United States in the Biden-Harris administration. And my role there, it was to basically build the data backbone for the president's equity agenda. So we focused on disaggregating data across agencies so we could identify disparities across demographic characteristics, including SOGI, and then use the levers of federal government to fix them. So, what I wanted to talk about now is what we can do given the current climate. And what is worth noting is that um, many of us, including myself, have sort of taken the data that we have from the from federal government for granted. Certainly, the gains that were made in recent years with SOGI data were sort of hard fought, hard won, and over the course of years and decades. So I think SOGI data is unique in that people are not taking it for granted, the fact that it existed. However, when I talk to folks about the data, the federal data that they depend on, there's often an interesting dichotomy. And one is like, we needed this data and it was absolutely essential. And then the second was like, and it wasn't really fully meeting our needs, and we needed it more disaggregation, more intersectionality, we needed more detail, more privacy protections, whatever the case. So there's always this tension between like the progress that we've made and the continued progress that we need to make to improve the quality and nature of federal data to better serve all Americans. And so with that in mind, this idea of public participation has always been essential to SOGI data in particular, and the stakes are even higher now. One distinguishing factor about these data that I think is worth noting as we talk about the different lines of activity that are ongoing in civil society to help monitor and protect SOGI data is that what Lauren and Alana and Caroline were describing was sort of the surgical removal of data elements, but the whole data sets tend to still be there. So the loss is like less glaring because the data set's still there. It's just pieces have been removed. And so the engagement around them needs to be specific and probably a stronger case needs to be made for putting those elements back in. And so just a few examples of resources that were places where you can plug in. So, and I do recommend at this point, like anybody who is a data user or who benefits from data, which I think is most of us, at this point, we also need to find ways to be advocates for the continued flow of federal data. The first resource was mentioned already a few times, and that's dataindex.us. And that is a collection that I'm really proud to be a part of, where we're monitoring changes to the federal statistical system and data writ large. One simple thing that you can do there is just sign up for the newsletter. We have colleagues like Megan Morey who are monitoring the Federal Register and also Reg Info for changes to specific data collections, and looking for those policy windows where public comment is going to have an outsized impact on hopefully protecting these data, or at least documenting for the public record the harms if the data disappear. Part of Data Index is a feature that we just released, which I'm really excited about because it helps reduce some of the ambiguity about what the risks to specific data sets or even specific data elements like SOGI data are. And that's the new data checkup. And so you can find that at dataindex.us. And the unit of assessment here is the data set itself, but we do address risk to specific data elements where relevant. And we use a 6-point assessment criteria, including our historical data available from this data set on still in the federal web space. Does it seem like the collection and publishing will continue into the future? what is the state of the quality of the data? Is there a statutory context that might be protective of the data, as we heard from, for example, with the National Crime Victimization Survey, where the law had a protective effect there? What are the staffing and resource changes that might impact the continued flow of these data? And then lastly, are there any policy issues related to this data set or elements within it, like SOGI, that might make it particularly vulnerable to being pulled down? In this case, that day one executive order 14168, if that specifically implicates a data set, then we know that elements within that data set might be at risk. So encourage you to check out the data checkup. And if there's a data set that you really care about, this is a sort of a digital bucket brigade. So if you want to, scrub in and adopt a data set, please let us know so that we can continue to monitor the health of the data that we all care about and use. The next resource I wanted to mention is one that's been there since the beginning and was really inspired by a lot of great work in the first Trump administration, and that's the Data Rescue Project, which has been from the beginning archiving and preserving at-risk data sets. It's sort of like the center of gravity for all of these archiving efforts, and there's a very robust community behind the scenes there, where if a data set is at particular risk, where people jump in and make sure that the data are archived and well documented. The next resource is America's Essential Data, which is also something that I'm involved in. And this is really some unfinished business that I've had, because even as chief data scientist of the United States, I always felt like we weren't doing a great job of talking about how federal data benefit everyday American lives and livelihoods. And especially that's the case with SOGI data. And we've found that telling the story about why these data matter can itself be very protective. It also changes the narrative that we're seeing in the media. And so we've got around 100 use cases now about specific federal data sets and how they benefit everyday Americans. And we would love any submissions from you that center the person who benefits, not the person who uses the data, but actually who's benefiting from these data ultimately, and how are they benefiting. So would love your submissions. And also we hold workshops to figure out for our favorite data sets how we might best craft a one-sentence love letter about that data set and how it does benefit all Americans. And then lastly, the LGBTQI plus archive. This is such an amazing resource because, we've been focusing mostly on data, like sort of the numbers about the SOGI population, but around that is so much knowledge, the reports and the research and the methodology that have been collected that are that normally one would expect to find in a government archive that have been pulled down or at risk of being pulled down or just turned off. And so there you can find the equity action plans, and it's an incredible amount of detail dating back years. And I'm just so grateful for that information is not only archived, but also easy to find. And so that's a fantastic resource as well for the context around the data. And then of course, our colleagues at MAP and Williams have hinted that they're going to be continuing to publish resources. So keep an eye out for that, because they the scale of the losses, the 360 plus data sets that have been impacted, is just really massive. The SOGI data that's the place in the federal space that's really taken the biggest hit in the current administration. So I'm just really grateful for the work of MAP and Williams to document that and help us hold ground where we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise, and Alana and Lauren and Caroline. Now we have time for some of your questions. And there have been a couple questions posted in the chat. Why don't we start off with one that says, if states share administration of tools like the BRFIS, so lots of federal data sets are actually collected at the state level. Question is, can states still ask SOGI questions even if the federal government doesn't integrate them into their data set? Somebody want to take that?
Yeah, I could start, and I think others on the panel might have a lot of really important thoughts on this. But from a, I would say for upfront, yes, that states can continue to ask these questions. But there is this question of whether the federal government will attempt to enforce its policy upon the states that receive federal funding, and therefore, to the extent that states are using federal funding to administer YRBS and BRFIS, which presumably they are, um, how can that be? Will the federal government have the ability to force that? However, we are Caroline and I and Lauren as well have worked quite a bit on trying to really build up and support state data collection during this time, especially given that there are some states that have pretty robust commitments to SOGI data collection. Um, and so I'll pause there and hand it to Caroline.
Yeah, I think the Burfist question I think is really a good one. For folks who are less familiar with it, it's the world's largest continuously conducted health survey system. It's been an incredible resource. It is conducted through state and federal partnerships, and first added sexual orientation measures almost a decade ago, I think, and gender identity measures as well. Later on, there are different modules for Burfist. So there is a core module and then there is an optional module. And SOGI measures have, for a little while now, been included in the optional module. If you go to look at the Burfist website and the current questionnaire for the optional module, you will see sexual orientation is still listed, gender identity is not. States, and I think this is maybe the shortest answer to the more pointed question, is like states should be able to use their own state dollars to ask a question about trans status. The CDC has been reported and has been implementing that it will not process data on trans folks. So states can get funding to ask the question on their own dime, and then would have to think about how the best way of processing those data, and to the degree that it is safe to do so, making those data publicly available for researchers and others to access. I think that's the short of it, but if there's anybody else that wants to jump in, please feel free.
Caroline, I'd love to add, so absolutely, this is having state and locals collect SOGI data during the in-between years is just really good for resilience for this type of data. And we're seeing it across different types of data as well. One opportunity this brings up that where there's some real urgency is very robust data governance at the state and local level and making sure that there's a participatory process. And that's going to be essential for rebuilding or building trust with communities that might feel vulnerable giving sensitive information. Also making sure Caroline, I appreciated that you talked about the funding for these additional SOGI questions coming from state or local dollars rather than federal dollars. That type of splitting is going to be really important, as are explicit policies that address privacy and security. And there are a few entities, I'll put the links in here, but there are a few entities that are helping build state and local capacity for data governance, data privacy, and security writ large, that I think any advancement of SOGI questions at the state and local level would fit right into really nicely.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there are a number of states that are considering this for both SOGI questions and other data resources that the federal government has in the past collected or financed. And if you are in a connected to your state demographer, to state government agencies that are involved in state data, I think this is an important time to advocate for that. As the speakers mentioned, because the federal government is using its financing of things to limit what are collected by private agencies, private organizations as well, like with the General Social Survey. That's collected by New York, but it is but because it's financed by the federal government, they can collect. So we need a lot of advocacy there. The next question was how can we weigh in on data removed without notice? I'm thinking about the CIA World Fact Book, which was removed a couple days ago, and which, just so you know, is available through the Internet Archives Wayback Machine. I'm not sure if it contained SOGI information. And I did put into the chat information about how to get involved with the data rescue project, because if you hear about data that you're concerned about data, letting them know is an important thing, and volunteering to help preserve data with that team of volunteers is a great way to address that. I don't know if others want to weigh in on data that's being removed without notice.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of places that you can catch the changes as being processed. So Lauren mentioned Reg Info, which is just probably the worst designed website on all of the internet. So I can't promise that it's very easy. But you can see on Reg Info when agencies are submitting to review by OMB changes that they are planning to make. And because a lot of these are not being deemed as substantive, they don't also have to post on the Federal Register. So you can see on Reg Info when a request has been submitted for approval through OMB. You could, in theory, submit a comment as part of that process. The other thing that we have done, which I think is a little bit easier, is that let's say there is a Federal Register notice that relates to a collection that you care about. It doesn't specify that SOGI measures have been removed or talk about, large parts of any data changes that are happening, but there is an open Federal Register notice asking for public comment and folks to weigh in about a collection. We, like MAP and Williams, have used that in the past as an opportunity to still weigh in and put on public record the fact that, hey, we have noticed these changes that are part of the information collection that you have a Federal Register notice about. And even though you're not asking us specifically about the fact that you've removed it, we still want to be on the record about the fact that we oppose those changes for X, Y, and Z reasons. So that is a little bit easier. Federal Register is easier to navigate than Reg Info. And I would encourage using that as a strategy to just get on the record, to mobilize coalition partners to get on the record in response to that Federal Register notice, I think remains really important, even though, again, a lot of this is kind of being done under the radar for the most part.
Here's a question that I think is for Denise, really, because I get to put this. It says, can you provide some examples of how the data affects individuals to help us think of ideas when we're submitting advocacy remarks?
I love it. Yeah. So one simple one is a few years ago, I got an email I had bought some peanut butter, and I got an email that that it might be tainted with salmonella. But the reason that was possible is because the online grocery store I ordered it from was able to use the Consumer Protection Bureau's data set on recalled products. And so it automatically was able to notify me that my peanut butter might be dangerous. Another example is a football coach can use NOAA's, the National Weather Service's heat index, to know when to move football practice inside during the summer so that the players don't die of heat stroke. So those are a few examples. And if you go to essentialdata.us, you can see a bunch of other examples floating around. What I've found in working with journalists is that when the example is like sort of unexpected or delightful, that tends to get a little bit more traction. And so, like, I personally could make equity use cases till the cows come home. And trying to find examples where maybe like a small business owner benefits, or like maybe the Bureau of Prisons' ability to fulfill its obligation to the Constitution benefits. There might be different beneficiaries that we could be creative about here to tell the story about why SOGI data matter, and I would love to do that. It's also a social activity, so no need to like toil away by yourself. Like get together a few friends, reach out to me. Let's do like a small sort of group workshop to figure out how to make the most compelling stories about why SOGI data matter to everyday Americans.
Thank you, Denise. And actually, I love the idea of getting together for people to do this. We've had a number of hackathons that we've organized and others and the Data Rescue Project has organized. It is really a great way to bring people together. Next question is, how reliable are existing public use data given this erasure and manipulation? And this person says, I want to use the restricted US Census SIP, a survey income and program participation data for one of my projects, but my proposal was rejected by the US Census, citing the executive order and the DEI nature of my project. I ended up using the public use SIP data with very limited information. Are they still reliable anyway? I'll allow people chime in. I want to say two things. One is that one of the most explicit cases of research censorship has been the Census Bureau's and the federal statistical systems using their control of restricted data, which is protected for confidentiality purposes, not for the policy purposes of the federal government. They've prevented any research on SOGI issues and DEI issues and climate issues quite generally, and stopped projects that were underway. That said, if you're still interested in trying to get access to the SIP data, if you could email me, I'd be happy to talk to you about how to do that. Does somebody else want to just take the data quality issue more generally?
Well, I will start, but then maybe also hand it over to Denise as well. I think we want to be careful when you're checking data sets, and that I think speaks to the importance of all of the resources that Denise highlighted, but especially the data checkup resource, which again has a very comprehensive sort of like matrix explaining what is at risk, how much can we trust the data that are being put out. When it comes to SOGI specifically, I think that is, more narrow than I think your question is a little bit broader. But we are working, and I know Williams in particular is working on sort of this very comprehensive overview of what has been removed, the evidence for that removal, and we're also connecting with ICPSR about how to make sure that unaltered versions of data sets are available. So I think that work is ongoing. But it is complicated. We've definitely seen instances, and Lauren, kudos to Lauren for catching this, but like instances where technical documentation for surveys that have already been collected, already been conducted, that documentation has then retroactively been changed to remove the fact that SOGI questions, either demographics or questions that allowed people to report discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity have actively been removed. And it's only through things like the Wayback Machine that we've been able to actually verify that those questions did in fact exist. So I think it really depends on the specifics of the survey and doing a deep dive using some of the resources that have been mentioned today in order to identify whether you're looking at an actually unaltered data set. But SIP is maybe more specific. And I also know that like we don't want to create panic or distrust when it comes to broader data sets if we don't know that they actually have been tampered with in some way. So maybe Denise, I'll pass that over to you.
Yeah, Caroline, with this question, what comes to mind for me is trust and sort of both directions of trust. One is, do the people using the data trust the data? And so I agree with you that caution and a solid methodology for assessing quality will be important. There's also the trust side where do respondents feel comfortable giving their information to the government in general and especially to the federal government? Because for me, that's where I think we're going to probably see the most concerns with data quality moving forward. If a collection continues, is just whether people feel comfortable filling out those forms.
Yeah, and to piggyback also on what you were saying on the trust piece, I think a lot of the work that MAP and other partners in this space have been doing is to really provide communities with the information that they need to make an informed decision about when and how to share their data, especially with the federal government in this current moment. So I think having those educational resources and hard community conversations is really important. I also think it's important to approach this with some nuance. Like, I think there are different levels of risks depending on the different types of collections that we're talking about. Administrative data is different than, these large scale general population surveys that we're sometimes talking about. So I would encourage folks to think carefully about the particulars of each collection when they're making those determinations.
Thanks, Caroline. And we are at time, so I'm just going to close us out quickly. I see three themes emerging. One is our collective action to hold ground where we can through archiving, public comments, and other actions around SOGI data. The second is to build state, local, and civic capacity to collect and use and protect SOGI data to keep the momentum. And the third is to prepare to move forward when the climate toward evidence and equitable outcomes improves. So thank you all for joining, and happy Love Your Data Week.